Hello, hello, I'm MrShine, back once more for the conclusion of my Druid arena run. In my last video, I stumbled through a rather mediocre draft for a Druid, and was forced into a bit of a loser deck. As some predicted, this deck did not perform very well, and I think I can point to a few specific reasons why that was the case. Reason number 1, bad early game. I have a decent amount of playable 1 and 2 drops in this deck, but the quality is pretty lackluster. In particular, I have a handful of 2/2s, a 2/1, and an unstable ghoul 1/3. If I face 2/3s in the early game, or heroes that can ping, I'm going to be having a rough time trying to stabilize the board if my opponents get off to a good start. The early game is one of the most important parts of any arena run, so I could lose a few games straight out with poor starts. Reason number 2, little removal. 1 Claw and 1 Starfire probably won't cut it in this run. Since I already discussed my early game woes, there's a good chance I'll have to play catch up in the mid game. However, I have no Swipes or Wraths, the 2 best removal cards Druid has at their disposal. Most likely, I'll be at the opponent's mercy in the mid game by plopping down a minion and hoping they can't buff things that they have on board to trade up. Reason number 3, light late game. Usually, Druid has a few strong answers if a game goes late, which can help salvage an otherwise losing battle. I do have a few strong cards, but not enough to truly stem the tide. 1 Iron Bark against the board from the enemy might just be a speed bump and force them to use their best removal, but 2 Iron Barks will usually grind an opponent's board to dust and force them to make hard trades. I don't have enough follow-ups to my late game punches to really turn games around here. So with those 3 reasons, it's probably unsurprising that this deck only ended up with a 4-3 record. In this video, I'll discuss contentious draft picks, we'll give a quick recap of some of the games I played, and then we'll go play by play over some of the games I played that were deep in the arena. But first, on to the draft review. There weren't too many picks that were given a second glance by viewers, partly due to the fact I had a lot of picks where I was forced into only one reasonable card, or all the picks were almost equally bad. The one that received the most flack, however, was my distaste for Bite, the 4 mana, 4 damage removal spell for Druid that also gives you 4 armor. I was pretty down on Bite. I believe I said explicitly, Bite is bad, at least twice in my last video. I stick by my reasoning. It's almost categorically worse than all other top tier removal cards in the arena, and when you put it next to Swipe, for example, it isn't even close. The only saving grace of Bite is its 4 armor gain, but as we discussed before, the arena is all about controlling the board, and life can often be used as a resource to ensure that the board can be removed. This is why Fiery War Axe is so good. You sacrifice face damage in exchange for killing 2 early game minions. The theory is in the long run that face damage you took early on will help ensure that you control the game the rest of the way. When you have the board and the opponent is forced to react to you, you can maximize the value from cards that buff creatures, and you can pick and choose the best times to use removal cards to ensure that your board remains healthy. Unless you face an extremely aggressive deck that has lots of ways to burn you down, consider the sacrifice of life as an investment that helps you win the game. At the risk of waxing too philosophical, another thing people brought up was bad removal is better than no removal. To this I at first agreed, but as I thought more, I'm not so sure. Why? Why is bad removal better than no removal? I'd argue a good minion on curve is better than inefficiently spending mana to play a spell that will remove a weaker threat. Good value minions help give you good trades, and when you can snowball good trades while dropping more threats, the need for removal ends up going down because your board can take care of most threats. On pick 4, I had the option to pick Bite and didn't because I felt like Ravenhold Assassin was slightly better, although I will concede that pick 10 had the potential to choose Bite because all options were quite bad. To be fair though, I didn't dock anyone points for picking Bite there, so it was perfectly acceptable at that time. So with questions about the draft out of the way, let's move on to the general gameplay of the run. The run itself was really a tale of 2 halves. I began by going on a 4-win tear, winning rather handily in most of my games. My first game was against a Priest, who started off with a turn 1 Light Warden, something that actually has potential to deal damage. I decided to coin out my Mana Wraith with the expectation that it might eat removal early, or my opponent would heal me to make the Light Warden a 3/2. It turns out they didn't know how Light Warden works, while allowing me to trade and get value from the Wraith, but awkward, I blocked myself from a play the following turn. From that point though, I always had the board, and with the power of Defender of Argus, I was able to snowball the board and cruise to victory. Lesson of the day? Most 1-drops not named Zombie Chow, Argent Squire, or Worgen Infiltrator are bad and should usually be avoided. When a Mana Wraith gets a value trade, you know you're in trouble. My second game was against a Warrior. and for the second time in a row I encounter an opponent with a turn 1 play. Fortunately, they missed their 2-drop, and I get a chance to throw my Mana Wraith into the fire once more as a sacrificial trade. From there, it was pretty neck and neck for a while, and the warrior actually started getting the upper hand on the board, forcing me to use Starfire on an out-of-control ghoul. The saving grace and the turning point of the game was the warrior's turn 7 play, dropping an overcosted 2/2 and armoring up. I mean, that turn is about as weak as you can get, and armoring up doesn't impact the board in the slightest. It gave me some breathing room to stick a big minion on the board. However, due to my health, the opponent decided to start the race. I was able to stabilize at 5 HP with a Question Adventurer behind a taunt and card advantage, and was able to dodge enough top decks to pull out a victory. A very close game that almost ended before I could turn things around. My third game was against a Warlock, and for the third time in a row my opponent has a 1-drop, and I follow it up with a Mana Wraith. Deja vu, anyone? Anyways, surprisingly my opponent chooses to protect his Flame Imp by coining out a Shadow Bolt. I don't think the Flame Imp is worth protecting quite so much here, and I was able to seize the board by bringing out Claw and Mad Scientist. From there he followed up with an Amani Berserker, a great play if I didn't have a Defender of Argus to buff the Scientist, and get an even stronger hold on the board. The Warlock was forced to Hellfire to reset the board, but my Darkscale Healer was a significant minion to place on an empty board, and the follow-up Starfire was perfect for clearing his Yeti. On turn 6 though, the Warlock had no more time to screw around and punched himself in the face with a Pit Lord that received a Demon Fire buff. Based on the damage I had in hand and the life total the Warlock was placed at, I figured this was as good a time as any to start racing for damage. Despite the faceless of the angry Pit Lord, I was able to steal the win in time before the Warlock started clearing things up. A quick game that part of me feels could have gone very differently if my opponent would have focused on playing minions in the early game and accepting the Flame Imp into Mana Wraith trade instead of coining out an early Shadow Bolt on a 2 HP minion. In game 4, I dodge a 1-drop for my opponent, breaking the combo, but I figured what the heck, why not keep some semblance of tradition alive and play my trusty Mana Wraith once again. The reasoning was, since he played a Wild Growth, the Mana Wraith could upset his curve. Unfortunately for me, it turned out the Druid had a 2/3 Croc, Mana Wraith Kryptonite. Things were looking like they could be trouble for me. However, on my opponent's turn 5, he decided the hero ability and used Wrath to draw a card, which was quite a tempo hit on that turn, and one I was able to capitalize on using my Druid of the Claw. From that point I played very aggressively, forcing my opponent to run into my minions with his Ventricle Mercenary, and forcing him to make the trades as I attempted to overwhelm the board. The Druid eventually succumbed, and I was sitting pretty at 4-0. So, at this point I was feeling pretty good about being able to get this deck to a 4-0 start. However, here's where things took a turn for the worse, as I followed my start up with 3 consecutive losses. I'll take a look at a few of the more interesting games and try to break them down play by play to discuss the different decisions I had. During my second loss, during the Mulligan Stage, even though Mad Scientist is bad, it's usually going to be decent enough in the early game if it's going to come up at all. I had a lot of bad true drops though, so I didn't think it was worth me sending it back. I send the rest back and get stuck with a somewhat awkward starting hand with a bad 2, a situational 3, and a clunky 4 that will hurt my tempo if I have something alive on the board. At least it's a curve. In turn 1, because I have a single 2-drop in my hand, it's not worth using the coin here. I want to use the coin to smooth out my curve, and if my opponent plays nothing next turn, I'll be forced to hero ability. It's better to wait now and see if I can amp something else up. Turn 2, hey, a 2 HP totem, a perfect target for my crummy Mad Scientist to plow into. No need to use the coin here when the Mad Scientist seems to work. Turn 3, Harvest Golem is an absolute nightmare for my 2/2 on the board. It won't even pop the Death Rattle. I can't do anything about that right now though, so I decided to get at least a little value out of the Flesh-Eating Ghoul by turning it into a 3/3. With any luck, my 3/3 Ghoul will be able to trade evenly with the Harvest Golem at any rate. Turn 4, Yeti is of course a super strong card, and the fact I lost my 2-drop for free to the Harvest Golem is already quite bad for me. I figured this was as good a time as any for me to coin out the Druid of the Claw. My thinking is my opponent will have to run both minions into it, making my Ghoul a 6/3 and breaking the first portion of the Harvest Golem. I then have the option of trading the Ghoul into the Yeti, Or if I was feeling greedy, I could simply finish off the Harvest Golem and heal it back up to 3 HP with the Darkscale Healer afterwards. I didn't want to take a tempo hit by playing the Brewmaster, so this seemed like the best play I had. Turn 5. The Hex on my Druid of the Claw hurt, since nothing gets killed on the Shaman side of the board. At this point I figure I can at least get some value from the Ghoul by trading it into the Yeti, and the Darkscale Healer is a respectably sized minion given the current board state. I could have played the Brewmaster, but it would have been a bit off the mana curve, and using my hero ability to trigger the Harvest Golem's Death Rattle would be useless, because a 2-1 would stay on the board and my only follow-up would be to play Fairy Dragon. Turn 6. I continue to play from behind on the board, and the 6/6 Frostwolf Warlord is quite formidable. I decide to go taller by playing the Ogre, since it should be able to kill the Warlord and survive. And if Shaman traded into the Healer, I had a Claw in my pocket to help finish it off to protect the Ogre. Playing Savage Roar would only have served to clear the 6/6 with my 4/5, but again the only other card I could have put on the board was Fairy Dragon, and the Harvest Golem was still mucking up that plan. Turn 7, my opponent sees me play the Ogre and decides to go wide instead of tall, giving me a ton of sticky targets to deal with and putting up a taunt totem for good measure. Simply playing the Ravenhold Assassin would be quite risky here because I'm staring at least 12 damage to my face down next turn, and with the variety of minions my opponent has on the board, I need to find a way to deal with them within a turn or two. My only option that remains is to try to lay down my own army of cheap dudes, but even that is pretty lousy since his Harvest Golems will make short work of me. At this stage in the game, his little minions simply outclass mine. Turn 8. So many threats, and my hand lacks the ability to deal with them. What I wouldn't give for 2 swipes in my hand right now. I would have been able to clear the board completely and could have kept a full health Ogre on the board to smack face. Sadly I don't have 2 swipes, and instead I have the clunky Brewmaster, a near useless Savage Roar, a super expensive Ravenhold Assassin, and a Leper Gnome that dies to a gust of wind. I'm outgunned here and don't have enough minions to throw on the board to counteract the tempo advantage the Shaman has. The next 2 turns are a matter of him slowly grinding me down. Without any board sweepers, I don't have enough time to make my board work for me, and I take my second loss. The final game was against a mage, and there were quite a few clunky spots I encountered in the early game that I'll walk through now. First, the Mulligan. I send it all back. The Questing Adventurer is not something you want to play on turn 3, especially not when I'm going first without the coin as an additional boost. What I get in return is okay, I guess. As I said before, these are weak 2s, but at least they're 2s, and hopefully they'll be able to trade with my opponent's 2-drops unless... oh god, it's a Zombie Chow. I mean, look at how good this card is compared to what I currently have. For 1 mana, the Zombie Chow is going to outclass my 2-drops, and will be able to live to trade another day. This is an example of why the Zombie Chow is so good. I end up playing the Unstable Ghoul because it sets the mage up in a situation where he might want to use his hero ability to clear it. Turn 3, I use my hero ability to clear the Zombie Chow, but in retrospect I think this was actually a big mistake. What I should have done is played my 2-3 and hopefully draw out another ping from the mage to clear it. That could have opened me up to playing both the Wraith and the Mad Scientist on turn 4, and slow down the mage's tempo further with the Wraith's ability. The downside of this is I wouldn't have a turn 5 play to follow it up unless the mage spent removal on the Wraith. Still, this was much better than simply ceding board control to the mage on turn 3. In turn 4 I get cheeky and decide to drop the Wraith down and see if it can screw my opponent's curve up. I hope that my Mana Wraith will trade with his Scarlet Crusader and set me up for a strong turn 5 Druid of the Claw. Unfortunately for me, disaster strikes. In turn 5 the plan blows up in my face, and my Mana Wraith needs to be traded away if I want to bring out my Druid of the Claw. No other answer is good, since a 2-2 and a 2-3 are going to be more sentient food. So the best I can hope for is the Druid of the Claw clearing his board. Turn 6. Ooh, another Druid of the Claw. Since he didn't have a perfect answer last time, maybe he won't have a good way to remove it this turn. The downside is my entire hand is Flamestrike bait after this turn, so I'll need to hope for a better card next turn, or at least be wary of a board clear. Turn 7, the Novice Engineer pulls a Fireball for the Mage, and it's the perfect answer to my board. I'm now forced into a position where Flamestrike will wreck me, but I think given the board state I have to go all in and risk utter destruction. I can't play too cautiously at this point because otherwise the Mage will simply overwhelm me, so the best I can do is play my hand and pray. Turn 8. The good news is the Mage clearly doesn't have a Flamestrike. The bad news is he still handles my board fairly well, and was able to pull a secret with his Mad Scientist to boot. I decide to try and bait out Counterspell with a cheap spell, and then I figure I'm more willing to give the Mage 2 Shattered Sun Clerics than 2 more draws Novice Engineers, should the secret be duplicate. It turns out it isn't, so that leaves Vaporize, Ice Barrier, or one of the epic Ice Block or Spellbender cards. In either case, I'm able to get a small handle on the board at this point, even though I'm still down a few cards. In turn 9, I want to aggressively fight for board because that's all I have left. I decide Starfire is worth it here because it can give me another card, and I'm also able to determine the remaining secret is Ice Barrier, so my Ghoul won't eat dust when it attacks. The Ghoul is low HP, but I'm able to at least put some pressure on the turn. Turn 10, the Sludge Belcher turns what little board I had into smithereens. All I can do now is play what I can from my hand and try to get things under control. I trade the Ghoul into the Belcher because the Mage is representing another hero ping to kill it next turn, so I might as well get some value from it. Turn 11, the Mage isn't putting down big threats now, and another Dark Iron Dwarf gives me a good body to taunt up with Argus. Any Flamestrike will be disaster, but I'm beyond the point where I can play around one, so I have to assume it won't get drawn. I do have to take care though, since my HP is starting to get low. As we all know, mages love their spell damage reach. Turn 12. Uh-oh. Water Elemental is super strong and that Polymorph crushes what little board I had. I had no good responses at this point and have very little life remaining, so things look like they're at the end of the line. I'm going to speed up the remaining turns because I do get a decent series of cards combined with double Undertakers from the enemy Mage, and I start to come back on the board once more. Unfortunately, it was only a matter of time and the Mage eventually draws another Fireball to seal the deal. To be fair, any Flamestrike or other large threat would have likely been my doom, so I could only dodge death so long after I began the game so terribly. So in the end, we finished this run 4-3, well below my average, but considering the quality of my deck, I'm not too terribly disappointed with it. And as fate would have it, the reward I got from the pack was Mana Wraith, which to be fair, sums up the run and my deck pretty well. Underwhelming and situational. Well, that's it for today! If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, check out more content at HearthstonePlayers.com, and subscribe to the YouTube channel for weekly videos. You can also check out my personal YouTube channel if you want to see other gaming content. As always, I've been MrShine, and I'll see you next time!